Hello biology students, and welcome to this video where we're going to be discussing the characteristics of life. Now, biology is the study of life. It's the study of what makes something living. So therefore, it's really important for us to know what the characteristics of a living thing are, so that way we can determine if it's living. If we are only interested in studying how living things work, we want to be able to tell if something is living or not. Now, this might seem pretty obvious for something like a human, where we know we're living, and we know that plants are living, and I think most of us know that something like a starfish is living, but then, what about this virus? Is that a living thing? So it's important to have these benchmarks that we can use to determine if something is living or not. So we have 7 characteristics, 7 things that have to be true about something in order for it to be living. So they're listed here. We're going to go over each one in much greater detail, so don't feel the need to write these down in your notes real quick right now, because they'll be listed later. But the important thing about this list is that you can't have 6 out of 7. In order for you to be living, you have to have all 7 things. The first one is you have to be made of cells, and those cells have to show some level of organization. So this is kind of like really 2 things. So first of all, the cell, as we're going to discuss later on in the unit, the cell is the basic unit of life. You have to be at least at the cellular level in order to be considered living. So we're going to discuss the levels of organization in the next video, but just know that there are different levels from teeny tiny atoms all the way up to a large organism. And if you aren't at least at the cellular level, you are not considered living. All living things have cells. And then these cells, in order to be considered a living thing, have to have a high degree of order within that organism. So for example, cellular organization is very replicated from one organism to the next. Like if you took 2 human beings, the placement of their cells would be almost identical. They are very, very organized. So living things have to have cells, and those cells have to be organized in a certain way. So the second thing that living things are able to do is that they are able to respond to stimuli. So stimulus here is the singular, and stimuli is the plural. So you may not have heard that word before. So what a stimulus is, it's a physical change, or physical or chemical change in the internal or external environment. So that's really vague. It's basically either a physical change or a chemical change that either happens inside your body or outside your body that you respond to. So I'm going to give you an example in a plant first. I think this is really easy to think about. And then we'll think about more examples in the human body. So I'm sure you're familiar with these plants. These are called Venus flytraps. And basically the way they work is they sit with their little mouths, not really mouths, their little leaves here open, and they have all these little teeny tiny microscopic hairs that you can't really see on this picture. And if a bug, like a fly, lands on their leaves, it will brush up against these hairs, causing the hairs to move, and that will cause a reaction in the plant. The plant responds to that stimuli and snaps shut, and then starts to release enzymes that will start to digest and break down the fly. So this plant is living because it can respond to the stimulus. In this case, the stimulus is an external thing. It's happening outside the plant, and it's a physical change. So it's physically responding to its little hairs being moved by the fly. So let's try to think of some examples in a human. So I want you to think about if you were in a dark room and then all of a sudden turned on the light and stared at the light, what would happen is your pupils in your eyes would all of a sudden get really, really small, because the pupil is the part of your eye where light enters. So if all of a sudden we have a lot more light in the room, you want to close your pupil to be smaller because you don't want that light to damage the cells inside your eyeball. So again, that's us responding to the stimulus. The stimulus is this external light, and our body automatically, it's not something we consciously do. Our body automatically will respond to that stimulus by having our pupils dilate. And that's something important about a response to stimulus. So make sure you have in your notes that these happen automatically. These are not conscious decisions. We don't decide to dilate or constrict our pupils. It happens by itself. So another example, if it's really, really hot out, your body will sense that temperature change and will respond by sweating to cool you down. Okay, so that's a response to a stimulus. Now, homeostasis is kind of similar to a response to stimulus and kind of different. So living things can maintain homeostasis. And what this means is they can maintain stable levels inside their body even though the outside environment is changing. So in other words, it doesn't matter if the outside environment is hot, doesn't matter if it's cold, doesn't matter if it's moist, doesn't matter if it's dry. The inside your living things' bodies stay the same. So they're able to maintain a stable body temperature despite changes on the outside. Water levels in the blood stay the same. Nutrient concentrations in the blood stay approximately the same. So living things can maintain a stable internal environment, and that is vital for life. If inside of your body was constantly changing, it would be very difficult for your body to run the processes that are required in a living thing. So let's look a little bit at how this happens. So we maintain homeostasis using what are called feedback loops. So there's two types of feedback loops. The one that I really care about and the one that I want you to understand in this class is called a negative feedback loop. We're going to talk about the other type as well, but let's focus on this one for now. So a negative feedback loop is a response in which the system, and you can think of the system as being the body, in which the body responds in the opposite direction of a stimulus. So what this does is it returns to the normal level to maintain homeostasis. So I'm going to give you a non-body example first, and then we'll talk about a body example. So let's first talk about the thermometer in your house. The thermometer in your house functions via a negative feedback loop. So imagine you want your house to be 70 degrees. And say it's the middle of the summer, so it's pretty hot outside, and your brother or your sister opens the door and all this hot air rushes in. So the temperature rises to above 70 degrees. Well, the thermometer will recognize that it's gotten too hot, and it will respond to that stimulus by moving in the opposite direction. So it got too hot, so it will pump out some cold air. It will respond in the opposite direction to return it back to 70. So now imagine, so now we're back at homeostasis. We're back at the normal level. Now let's say you open the refrigerator and all this cold air, so all the warm air in your house is moving into the fridge, making the house colder. So now it gets a little bit below 70. Your thermometer recognizes this and responds in the opposite direction again and heats up the house to bring it back to 70. So that's a negative feedback loop where the response is happening in the opposite direction of the stimulus. Something very similar happens in your body. So body temperature, maintenance of body temperature is an example of a negative feedback loop in your body. And there are thousands of negative feedback loops in your body, but this is just a really easy example to understand. So the same thing, you want your body temperature to remain around 98.6 degrees approximately. If you get too hot, maybe you're outside in a hot summer's day, your body will start to sweat, right? It will help to cool you down, so it responds in the opposite direction. And then say you walk into an air-conditioned house and you get a little bit cold, you'll start to shiver, right? You'll start to, and your blood vessels will constrict, helping you to maintain heat and heat back up. So that's a negative feedback loop. That's the one that's really important for homeostasis. I do want to also mention positive feedback loops. Most examples of positive feedback loops are kind of hard to understand, so we're just going to focus on one. Technically, they do help to maintain homeostasis, but it's kind of much more complicated. So a positive feedback loop, just like it sounds, is a response in which the system responds in the same direction as a stimulus, basically amplifying it. And this only happens for a short amount of time, and positive feedback loops often occur in order, like if a really strange, uncommon situation were happening in the body, and the body's trying to get that situation to be over as quickly as possible. And I know that explanation is kind of confusing, but let me give you an example and maybe it will make more sense. So the example I'm going to give you is childbirth. So obviously, like the normal homeostasis, like the normal homeostatic situation is like not giving birth to a child. So if childbirth started and the body tried to use a negative feedback loop, then the baby would never be born, and that would be an issue. So instead, we're going to use a positive feedback loop for childbirth to try to get basically birth over with as quickly as possible, so then we can return to homeostasis after the event is over. So the way childbirth works is, when the child is being born and the baby's head is pushing on the mother's cervix, trying to exit the body, that's going to release a hormone, and that hormone travels to the brain. Okay, so imagine we have pressure on the cervix, and that releases a hormone. And what that hormone does in the brain is the hormone actually sends a signal back down to the abdominal muscles and the vaginal muscles and tells the body to push harder. And by contracting harder, there is more pressure from the baby's head on the cervix. And that more pressure is more hormone. And more hormone is more pressure. And it's going to keep amplifying that response until the baby is born. And after it's born, now we're back to homeostasis. Now the body is back to a normal level of no pressure and no hormone, right? So you can see this is kind of different. This is kind of, like I said, the positive feedback loops are a little harder to wrap your head around. Negative feedback loops are much more common, but I wanted you to be exposed to positive feedback loops as well. Just remember that positive feedback loops have a response in the same direction as the stimulus, and it basically amplifies that stimulus to make it become over faster, so it only happens for a short period of time. Okay, so that was a lot about homeostasis. So now our fourth requirement for something to be living. So we talked about cells and organization, response to stimuli, and homeostasis. The fourth requirement is all living things have a metabolism. In other words, all living things can break down, can take energy and material and basically turn it into a food source or vice versa. So plants are living, so they can take sunlight energy and carbon dioxide and water and make sugars. We can't do that because we're not as cool as plants, but we can then break down that food source into energy. Right, we can break down our food to make energy for our bodies. So therefore, we have a metabolism kind of in the opposite direction of what I was talking about with photosynthesis. And then we use that energy we make to fuel our body, to move our body, to repair things in our body. So that's a metabolism. All living things can do that. I do want to mention this other word here. Chemosynthesis is something that certain archaea do. Archaea are kind of a organism that's similar to a bacteria, where they can make food out of chemical energy and then different inorganic compounds. So some things like plants and archaea can make food from energy and materials, and then all organisms, including bacteria, plants, animals, fungi, we can break down food to make energy. That's metabolism. So the next requirement for something to be considered living is it has to be able to grow and it has to be able to develop. So these two words mean two different things. So the first one is growth. Growth is pretty simple to understand. You start out small and you get bigger. Now what makes this slightly more complicated is the way you get bigger. So if you're growing from an infant into an adult, you get bigger because your cells divide to make more cells. Now, sometimes your cells get bigger, like each cell individually gets bigger, but we're going to see later in the year this is really not the case. Like 99.99% of your growth comes from you getting more cells through cell division, which is one cell dividing to make two. Now, development is something different. Development is the process by which an organism becomes a mature adult. So in humans, this happens largely through puberty, right? We develop different characteristics as we get older. But development can also be from something called cell specialization. So I want you to imagine, while you were still developing in your mother's womb, a lot of your cells were not specialized. They did not do specific jobs. So say you had a general cell. Now, this general cell, you became more developed as this general cell divided to create different cells that have different jobs. This is called cell specialization. So if this cell divided and one of these new cells is now a red blood cell, the cell has now specialized. It has a specific job. So that's often, that can be considered development as well. So the second to last requirement for living things is all living things can make more of themselves. They can all reproduce. So organisms producing new organisms, that's reproduction. And this is really important because it allows us to pass our genetic information, our hereditary material, down from one generation to the next. We can pass on our DNA. We're going to get into this way more in some later units, but for now, know that there's two types of reproduction. We have the one that we all think of, that's sexual reproduction, and this is what humans do, and most organisms that we're familiar with do. And it's when you have two parents, so you're combining the genetic material of two organisms to make one baby organism. You can kind of think humans have a biological mother and biological father combine their DNA to make an offspring. Now, a lot of organisms, probably not the ones you think of, but a lot of organisms, like bacteria, do asexual reproduction, which means they basically clone themselves. There's one parent and one offspring, and the parent and offspring are identical. You can kind of think in sexual reproduction, we're not identical, because if you have two parents, by definition, the child can't be identical to both. But if you have asexual reproduction, you only have one type of genetic material, so the offspring looks just like the parent. It's a genetic clone. And finally, the last requirement for a living thing is that living things over time change. They evolve. I'm going to be super vague with this one because we're going to do an entire unit on this. But just know that if you looked at human beings over time, human beings 5,000 years from now will not look like human beings are today. As a species, we change throughout time. I do want to point out now is that individuals cannot change over time, okay? So like you as you are, you're not going to magically sprout wings and begin to fly. You cannot change over time genetically, but the genetic makeup of the human population can change over time. So populations evolve, not individuals. And we're going to explore this much later in time, okay? So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.